And now we're going to move away from domestic and have a conversation about America and the global energy market. So please help me in welcoming to the stage Mark Menezes, President and CEO of the U.S. Energy Association. And with him is Erik Oswald, the Vice President of Advocacy and Policy Department of ExxonMobil. If you want to come up to the stage, I will speed up your introductions, but welcome to the stage. Thank you, guys.
Well, great to be here. Thank you very much for having us. I'm Mark Menezes. I'm President and CEO of the United States Energy Association. And for those of you who don't know much about the United States Energy Association, we are celebrating our 100th year of being in existence. We are a nonprofit, apolitical organization that was created back as part of the World Energy Congress when the world in 1924 really saw a need to make sure that the then newly developing petrochemical sources of energy and other growing sources of energy would be made available and accessible to all the countries of the world. And so we have been at that mission now for 100 years. We are also a government contractor. We work with the United States Agency for International Development, with the State Department, and with the Department of Energy, as well as other agencies, in helping to carry out the mission of bringing energy across the world, particularly in the developing countries, and particularly in those countries in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, those that have been dependent on some countries that have maligned interest at stake. One anecdote, we were in the Ukraine in the early days of when Russia was putting troops and materiel on the border. We sought to hasten, along with others, the efforts to disconnect the Ukrainian electrical system from the Russian grid. We were able to do that, and in record time, about 3 weeks, to get it connected to the EU grid, and it has remained independent from Russia since then. Although battered, but efforts are underway really to restore and to rebuild. So that's a little bit about USEA, and of course joining me today is Erik Oswald, and I'll ask Erik to give a little bit of his bio.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. Erik Oswald. I'm a geologist by training. Been with ExxonMobil for 33 years. Started out as a research geoscientist there, and then spent most of my career in the upstream, looking around the world for oil and gas. And then when the company stood up this low carbon solutions bit, which we'll talk a little bit more today about, I was employee number 3 in that effort. And it's been a fascinating exercise watching that grow over the last few years to something that has 1,000 people working on it now, and it's deploying a lot of capital. And we'll spend a little bit of time here in the next few minutes exploring what those operations are that they're working on.
Well, thank you, Erik. You know, to get started with this, I'm sure several of you are wondering, what is the role of the traditional energy companies in the energy transition, right? I mean, we have a lot of new entrants, those that are really excited about taking advantage now of, new economies. But from the traditional energy companies' point of view, I'm curious, can you kind of, what's the vision and what's the role that you see how do you assess, how you might play a role during this energy transition?
Well, I've got a great resource for you all to look at that question with. Just a few weeks ago, we put out our version of ExxonMobil's Global Outlook, and it's got a great version for your iPhone and a great version for your computer. But what that describes is looking at the world's policy landscape, technology landscape, what markets are doing. It projects forward to 2050 how we see the energy world playing out, and that includes emissions, oil and gas, important minerals, that whole sphere that we're talking about. What's that going to look like in the future? So it's very different than other things you might have seen that are scenarios where they're asking the question, what would it take to get to net zero by 2050? And then you back calculate that answer. This is saying, what can I look at and see today and what does that tell me about what the future is going to bring? And that's got a lot of interesting insights. It would take a whole talk just to describe about that, but some highlights. The presence and demand for traditional, reliable, affordable oil and gas is going to be with us until through 2050. As a hallmark, oil production will maintain at about 100 million barrels a day throughout that entire time. So we're in a plateau, not a falling off of oil production. Emissions will fall, but they won't fall enough, and we'll struggle to meet the aspirations of the Paris commitments that the society's made. So there'll be a lot of important work to do on decarbonizing industry. To give you a sense of those emissions, about half of those emissions are going to be coming from the hard-to-abate sector, industrial sector, power sector, and commercial transportation. So things that are really easy, really difficult to decarbonize. We don't have good options to kind of substitute in and take the carbon out of those industrial processes. So, to kind of summarize, and I encourage you to look through the website. It's got a lot of great information in it, but the company has to deliver on traditional oil and gas for the foreseeable future through 2050. It's going to be very important for the world to have those resources, and the company's going to have to offer ways that we can help decarbonize heavy industry and commercial transportation. And that sort of sets up what the company's strategic directions are going to be going forward.
Well, thank you for that kind of high overview of your assessment. I was thinking as you were describing what your outlook said, I know that you can look at what the International Energy Administration had predicted about the peak use of fossil, I guess in the 30s. And I was curious about what others had said about this. This was before your outlook came out. But then you could go to, I was curious about what OPEC thought, right? I mean, they're in the business of providing fossil energy to the world. Their projections were markedly different from the IEA. Theirs was actually, it's along your lines, it's actually going to increase by 16% during that time period before it would abate. So instead of 100 million, it would actually, 1 million barrels per day for use of oil, it would actually go up to about 116. So it sounds like your Exxon outlook falls somewhere,
I think that's right. It's sort of in the middle there, and maybe the details aren't as important as the fact that there'll be this long plateau for the next couple decades in oil and gas production, and that's something that's going to be very challenging to deliver for society. So all the coworkers I have that are in that world of looking for oil and gas in the world to try to deliver to markets have a big job ahead of them, and a lot of money is going to have to be invested to kind of create that supply of oil and gas that society needs.
So Eric, we heard you talk about addressing the hard-to-abate industries, and we know that in the U.S. and around the world we're seeing dramatic declines in emissions in the power sector, primarily driven by the transition, from coal to, say, natural gas and increased renewables. Power sector is sort of, a good story to tell on emission reductions. You mentioned hard to abate in industries. What about transportation? So that's, people know of Exxon, they think transportation fuels, I would think. But can you describe a little bit about, ExxonMobil's approach to how to address this?
Yeah, the corporation has simplified its organization now for this energy transition period. So it has 3 basic operating arms. It has a traditional upstream company, a traditional downstream and chemicals company, and this new low carbon solutions company that I mentioned that I've started in just a few years ago. And so all of those entities are working on how to decarbonize their footprint and bring lower CI solutions, either energy or energy products, to the markets. And then low carbon solutions is trying to address customers' needs for decarbonization. And the verticals that we've kind of chosen to operate in are CCS, carbon capture and storage, clean hydrogen, and most recently lithium. So you can see we're in a bunch of different spaces that affect the transportation sector, and I think that's still ground in front of us, trying to figure out how those customers are going to behave. Is hydrogen going to be a part of the heavy-duty transportation sector? Are lithium batteries going to play a role for heavy-duty transportation? They certainly are playing a significant role for light-duty transportation. So the idea is the company's trying to position itself so that however these markets evolve, the company's positioned with the expertise and capability to be able to address those markets. Right now we have something like $20 billion of investments planned through 2027 just in the low-carbon solutions space. And we can talk about some of those large projects that LCS is undertaking here right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really curious about that. One of the roles USEA plays is we're trying to help the Department of Energy trying to figure out how it is to increase economically, hydrogen, to tie in with hydrogen hubs. So I'd be curious about sort of your prognostication and some of the difficulties there. On biofuels, we know the IRA has, of course, some tax credits for biofuels, but also the aviation fuels, sustainable aviation fuels, and then carbon capture. We know policymakers have looked at carbon capture for some time. We have the 45Q tax credits, right? But again, from Exxon's view with the history of figuring out engineering how to fund very highly capital projects, can you give us, kind of your insights on what you've gained in those areas?
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. When we look at the space, what we're looking for is how can we take the capability that we have, the expertise that we have as a company, and apply it in a meaningful, large-scale way to address the challenges of the energy transition. So we're looking for things that we can do at a large scale that'll drive the cost down, and things that leverage our traditional capabilities. So two great examples to talk about: hydrogen, clean hydrogen. We're in the process of designing and getting ready to make final investment decisions on what will be the largest clean hydrogen facility in the world. It'll be at Baytown, at our Baytown refinery outside of Houston. It'll produce something like 1 billion cubic feet a day of clean hydrogen, a blue hydrogen derived from methane. So this is something that's working off of the IRA tax credits. 45V is an important component of getting the investment to work. But it's a spectacular project. We've already cleared ground near the Baytown refinery for it. Design's been going on for a couple years, and there's all kinds of conversations going on with customers. Who's going to use that clean hydrogen? And it's a fascinating space because it's still evolving. I think some of the ideas we had when we started the project about who would be buying this clean hydrogen have evolved through time. Initially, we thought there'd be a lot of fuel switching where we'd be able to use clean hydrogen instead of methane. That's proven a little bit more difficult than we thought. Ammonia, clean ammonia customers have been kind of stepped up a lot more than we thought. So this is a really interesting tool for decarbonizing the power sector. We have customers in Asia and in Europe that want to buy clean ammonia, then they can blend it into coal-fired power plants and reduce the CI of the power that's being produced in those coal-fired power plants. So it has tremendous application, global application, in helping us start to work towards those Paris goals. But the markets are still forming, and the customers are we're still trying to work through who the customers are on that. Underpinning all of that is policy. And the policy, we've made good progress with the IRA, but there's still rulemaking. I think some of the speakers have previously mentioned that there's still rulemaking that needs to be finalized for the IRA and for 45V tax credit. And that's important work that needs to be done to be able to execute on these projects. In particular, one of the benefits that we have in that project is that we're producing the natural gas that will then be split into hydrogen. And so we can make investments on that natural gas value chain where we lower the CI of the natural gas being produced out of the wells. We lower the emissions that are, any emissions that are associated with moving that natural gas across Texas into the Baytown area. So you can make all these investments to create a differentiated natural gas product that further lowers the CI, the carbon intensity of the hydrogen that you're producing. And we need the rulemaking in the 45V tax credit to reflect those investments so that people are driving towards lowering the CI of the hydrogen for its ultimate use.
Yeah, very interesting and key points. You had mentioned policy. We know that Certainly in this town, everyone has heard about the permitting issues of this. And I'm just curious, I mean, Exxon typically might not necessarily need, the help from government agencies to do certain things, but it's hard to have a conversation about meeting the expectations of an energy transition without addressing that. And so I'm just curious, in your experience or from Exxon's point of view, what can policymakers do to help move this transition forward? You had mentioned getting the guidance out, but can they do more? And what would you suggest to Congress or the regulatory bodies to do?
Permitting is a huge issue and, of course, widely recognized. And that maybe takes us to the second major investment the company is working on right now. Some of you will have seen that we purchased Denbury recently, which possessed the largest CO2 pipeline in the United States, really in the world. And so that pipeline system is being repurposed now to a giant carbon capture and storage system where we can take industrial emissions all throughout the Gulf Coast area, put them in that pipeline, and then move them to permanent sequestration sites. So it's a spectacular example of large scale. If you get the scale up on these things large enough, you can drive the cost down, and then that helps customers afford the ability to pay for having their emissions sequestered. So we've got a number of contracts signed with emitters in that area. I think we have something like 5.5 million tons per year of CO2 emissions under contract that'll go into that pipeline. There's really nothing like that in the world in terms of contracted emissions right now. So it's a big step forward, and lots of work going on drilling wells to try to identify the ideal sequestration sites that are near that big pipeline system. But I'll tell you right now, all of those projects, the critical path item on all those projects is Class 6 permitting. In other words, the complex permitting process to get an injection well permitted so that you can start the injection of CO2. And for the government to get to the kind of goals it has for emissions reductions, we're going to have to look at some real significant changes and evolution in how we're permitting and the pace at which we're permitting. Because right now we're moving slowly through a few wells, maybe tens of wells in the country in the permitting process. And to get to where we need to get to on our greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to be doing hundreds or even thousands of wells. And so the pace of how we deal with this is going to have to be reviewed and optimized. And that's something we've been talking with the EPA about and had very good conversations trying to progress that. But that's a critical path for us right now on Class 6 permitting.
Well, Eric, I'm sorry to say, but I think we have exceeded our allocated time. But your insights, I think, have been very illuminating. And please join me in thanking Erik for speaking to us this afternoon.
Yes, and thank you, Mark, for that great conversation. Well, next up, we are very excited to introduce Representative